All right, guys, welcome to the second part of 4.3. Today we're going to look at the endocrine system and the excretory system. So let's start with the endocrine system. So what is the endocrine system? The endocrine system is a network of glands around the body that produce hormones that are used as messengers, okay? A gland is any organ that is going to produce and release a specific substance. So not exclusive to hormones, but all hormones come from some sort of gland, okay? Now, hormones are chemical messengers that the body is going to use to regulate physiology and behavior, okay? So it's used to communicate between organs and tissues, and hormones will travel through the bloodstream and sometimes also through the lymphatic system, which is your lymph nodes, and they play a really, really important role in homeostasis, which is actually what we look at in the next chapter, okay? So aspects of the body that's regulated by the endocrine system includes digestion, sleep, movement, metabolism, lactation, reproduction, respiration, stress, mood, growth, excretion, and sensory perception. So a range of different things that your body uses to communicate with one another through these chemical messengers, okay? And here is an overview of the endocrine system. So you can see there, there's a few really important ones in your brain, the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, and also the pineal gland, the thyroid and parathyroid in your throat, the thymus, the stomach, duodenum, the adrenals, and the kidneys up in the middle, and then also your reproductive organs like the ovary and placenta, as well as testes, all play a really important role, okay? Now, hormones. Let's talk about hormones because hormones are fairly popularly, commonly used word, but not always well known. Hormones can only bind to cells that have specific receptors for that particular hormone. So as we looked at in chapter 2, we know that cells on the surface will have receptors on glycoprotein receptors or glycolipid receptors, all designed to receive messengers from other cells and other parts of the body. Well, this is what is triggering those receptors, right? So hormones, when it binds to the receptor, what it's going to do is going to generate a cellular change. In other words, the signal from the hormone is going to change the way the cell either acts or the way the cell changes its shape or whatever in order to receive and respond to that particular hormone, okay? So a single hormone can trigger different responses in multiple cells at the same time, and the more receptors that a cell has, the greater degree of sensitivity that the cell will have to that particular hormone. In other words, emphasizing the effects of that hormone and then magnifying the effects of that hormone, okay? So for example, let's say you have a cell here within a gland that's going to secrete the hormone. The hormone is going to go through the bloodstream, travels through the bloodstream, it's going to exit its target cell somewhere else in the body, and then it's going to bind to these target cell receptors, and then it's going to cause some sort of change in the body, right? Here's the same thing in action. You can see there that hormone insulin is going to trigger the release or the opening of a transmembrane protein that allows the sugar to be absorbed into the cell. So insulin being the hormone, and then the receptor on the surface is what allows glucose to go through another part of the cell. Okay. Now, there are primarily 3 types of hormones. You have what we call your lipid hormones, your peptide and your protein hormones, and then your amino acid derived proteins, which are somewhat related to peptide and protein hormones. Okay. Lipid hormones are what we are generally hydrophobic, and they're going to diffuse through the plasma membrane, and they're going to bind inside the cell. In other words, it's going to pass straight through the cell membrane, and the fatty acid hormones within the lipid category are what we call eicosanoids, and then the cholesterol hormones are called steroids. Okay, now I don't need you to really know key differences between fatty acids and cholesterol hormones, other than the fact that the name and also the function has to do with fatty acid in the phospholipid bilayer versus the cholesterol ones. The next category is the peptide and the protein hormones. They are hydrophilic, and they're going to bind to the surface receptor of the plasma membrane. They're not going to pass through the cell. They're going to bind on the surface of the cell, like, for example, insulin. Okay, and then your last category are your amino acid derived, which are hydrophilic, and they're derived from amino acids tyrosine, and tryptophan, which are really, really small ones. So for example, adrenaline and dopamine are amino acid derived hormones, and they act based on these particular amino acids here. Okay. There are heaps of different types of hormones that you have in your body, as well as corresponding glands that target with different functions. So this table summarizes a lot of them, but I'm just going through a few to give you a familiar idea of how some of these hormones work. Okay, so for example, your hypothalamus. Your hypothalamus is a gland on the inside of your brain, and that's going to release certain types of hormones. One of them is actually called dopamine. Dopamine is the fairly popular one because it's the feel-good hormone. Your body loves taking dopamine. It's like a drug because it makes you feel good about yourself, right? So when you go to the gym and you pump some iron, you get really tired, but then your body gets flushed with all of this dopamine that you feel really good and really accomplished about yourself, and you feel really happy, right? Other hormones can include insulin, which is what regulates blood glucose level, as well as a few other ones. So for example, human growth hormone, the hormone that kind of makes you grow, that's also in the hypothalamus. That's a peptide hormone, or an acid, a protein or peptide hormone. And then also there's a few other ones. So for example, follicle stimulating hormone, very important in development and secretion of estrogen, and also for ovulation and also for pregnancy. The FSH hormone is a protein derived that is hydrophilic and occurs in the ovaries. Okay. Now, we can't really talk about hormones and how they work without figuring out the idea of signal transduction. Signal transduction is the process that hormones undertake, particularly your protein ones, where it's basically a process in which the cells are detecting and responding to signals from an outside source, like for example hormones. Okay, this is based on the stimulus model, which you will look at in more detail in chapter 5. But basically, signal transduction involves 3 particular components. Okay, the first one is you've got to receive the signal. So the detection of the hormone by a receptor, and depending on the type of receptor it is, for example, if it's a hydrophobic receptor inside the cell or a hydrophilic receptor outside the cell. Remember, the protein hormones bind to hydrophilic receptors on the outside of the cell, and then also the lipid ones are going to bind to hydrophobic receptors on the inside of the cell. Okay. So that's the first one. The second one, second step is the transduction. So the relay of the hormone signal into the cell. So this include additional molecules that's going to cause some sort of chain reaction in the cell to kind of identify and process through that signal. And then that transduction process is going to lead to step 3, which is the cellular response. This is when the cell actually does something in response to the activation of the hormone and the signal transducing into the cell. Okay, the activation of cellular activity or process can be things like activating a particular ion channel, like for example in the case of glucose and insulin. It can also induce a particular gene to be expressed, and therefore kind of kick-starting the factory processing of certain ribosomes and producing more proteins. And then it also might induce cellular events like apoptosis, for example, and triggering targeted cell death. Okay, here's a diagram of signal transduction occurring. So you can see there, there's reception moving its way into the cell, into the nucleus of the cell, and then the second one is the transduction process, and then the third one is the cellular response, releasing or causing gene expression, and then the fourth one is then the protein synthesis of this particularly new cell, right? Here's a hydrophilic hormone attaching to a hydrophilic protein receptor on the outside of the cell, and then there's the transduction cascade that we're talking about there. That's going to then activate that same process again. Okay, the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland is a really important gland responsible for the endocrine system, and it is known as the master gland. It's going to produce a lot of the body's hormones, and it's only, including the ones that are going to help regulate the production of other hormones. So it's kind of like the brain of the hormones, okay? The pituitary gland consists of 2 parts. You've got the anterior pituitary, which regulates stress, growth, reproduction, and lactation, and then you also have the posterior pituitary, which connects the hypothalamus. Okay, a rough understanding is needed for this, so don't get too caught up in all the hormones, and all the particular parts. This is just to give you a general overview of the complexity of the pituitary gland, right? So there's your anterior at the front, and then your posterior at the back. And then here are some hormones that are released by the pituitary gland. Yeah, so human growth hormone, the stuff that makes you grow, that's triggered by the pituitary. Adrenocorticotropin, which is another one there as well that works together with your adrenal glands. The thyroid stimulating hormone, which is also works together with your thyroid to regulate your body temperature. And then also other ones like prolactin and things like that helps you feel good or feel bad, actually. Related to the pituitary gland is the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus is kind of like the 2IC, right? It is a small organ and it's located right next to the pituitary, kind of right there. The pituitary is down there, the hypothalamus is up there, and it connects the pituitary to the nervous system. Okay, so that allows your brain to then also be responsible for the chemical messengers in your body. So the hypothalamus is the computer link between the brain and the endocrine system. The nervous system and the endocrine system allows the two to speak to one another, okay? It's going to connect to and respond with the nervous system, and then it's going to regulate the pituitary gland. Sorry, it's going to connect to the pituitary gland to regulate the production of other hormones, as we mentioned earlier, okay? So very important in the process of regulating the body and homeostasis, which we look at in the next chapter. But things like, for example, like your heart rate, your blood pressure, all linked to your brain, obviously, but then using the endocrine system to either bring your heart rate up or down, or your blood pressure up or down, body temperature, fluid balance, and things like your sleep cycle. Okay, that was the endocrine system. We're going to look now at the excretory system and what the excretory system does. Excretion, the process of excretion, is the removal of unwanted, excess, or toxic products from the body. Okay, now excretion can be quite simple, or it can be quite complex. Okay, so in unicellular organisms, excretion just happens through the plasma membrane. You've got one cell floating in some water, it's just going to release its contents, the waste products, right into the environment. However, in multicellular organisms, because cells are all packed together, the inner cells need to get rid of their toxic waste systems, and so they're going to need specialized organs that are going to allow them to do that. And that's how your body has an excretory system or a urinary system. Okay, there are two actually major waste products in the body. Okay, you have nitrogenous wastes, which are based off nitrogen-based compounds in the body, which include things like proteins and amino acids. And then you also have carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is a waste product of the cell, and so the cell will produce nitrogenous waste and it will produce carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide gets removed by the respiratory system whenever you breathe out, and the carbon dioxide gets released, whereas the nitrogenous wastes are removed by the excretory system, including things like your kidney. Okay. A lot of people make the mistake of thinking that poop and feces and food waste through the digestive system are a form of excretion. They're actually not. It is kind of a waste product of the body, but the thing is that these feces and these waste products, they're not actually produced by the body, right? They're actually absorbed into they're taken into the body through the digestive system, and then all the nutrients gets absorbed, and then what's remaining gets pooped out. So they're actually not considered part of the excretory system, okay, or an excretory process, okay. And then the excretory system then filters the blood from the body to remove these nitrogen wastes. Okay, so it's connected to your blood and connected to your cardiovascular system. Okay, let's talk about nitrogen wastes. Okay, so the major source of nitrogen waste or N-waste come from proteins. During digestion, protein is broken down and amino acids are used by the animal. Excess amino acids, however, can't be stored. In other words, if your body takes in a lot of protein, it needs to either convert it into something that it can keep, or it needs to just dump it after it's used, right? So once it uses these amino acids, it's not going to be able to keep them anywhere in the body. It needs to dump them and get rid of them, all right? And so it needs to do that by converting these amino acids into something that can then be removed, okay? So ammonia NH3 is often removed in these nitrogen wastes. The carbon skeleton is kept and then converted into some sort of other molecule. And then many times the ammonia then gets converted into the urea in the liver, and then the urea then gets filtered through the blood. Okay, so the liver plays a really important role in converting these things. Okay, here's the chemical structure if you're interested, and particularly if you take chemistry as a subject, right? And here's what it looks like. You've got a carbon backbone in the middle there, and then attached to it is hydrogen at the top. The amino group, which is the part of the amino acid that gives its name, that's where the nitrogen comes from. So that's the nitrogenous waste. The carboxyl group is on the other side, and then the R side chain contains a whole host of other things that gives the amino acids its identity, right? So this stuff, this is toxic, right? Your body needs to get rid of it, and so it converts it into ammonia. Now, depending on the type of animal you are, it is going to kind of be converted into a different molecule. Okay, so fish, they just kind of dump their amino acid. They dump their ammonia directly into the water around them, and so ammonia is highly toxic, and it's produced in the liver, and so fish are going to just dump it straight out into the water, because you're a fish, you live in water, it's easy to then just chuck the ammonia into the water, right? Doesn't require a lot of energy to dump that, and then here's a whole bunch of other things that you can read if you want to, but I don't expect you to remember. Urea, which is what we do, urea is actually really non-toxic in comparison to ammonia, and so you can stack a lot of it inside of your blood before your blood becomes really toxic, right? But you don't want to stack too much of it in your blood. It's produced also in the liver cells, requires a little bit more energy to convert it because it is a bit more water soluble. So there's urea, Ch4.3, right? And it's not as toxic, so you can store more of it in your body for a longer period of time, more than ammonia, but not that long really. And it's kind of soluble in water, and it's kind of okay, right? Uric acid, this is what birds release, right? So birds release uric acid, CH5 and H4N4O3. It's completely non-toxic, and it's also produced in the liver cells, and it requires the most energy to convert. So birds actually do a lot of work in converting their ammonia into uric acid, and then they just dump it and poop it, which is why bird waste is actually insoluble in water. When the bird poops, you often notice that the poop is both the feces and also the white stuff is the corrosive uric acid that it's releasing from its excretory system as well. So birds don't pee, so to say. They just kind of poop one giant piece of feces from the digestive system and also nitrogen waste from the excretory system as well. Okay, the main organ in humans that are responsible, and actually a lot of other animals that are responsible for excretion, are the kidneys. And so we're going to talk about the kidneys. So other than CO2, right, all other metabolic waste are going to be transported to the kidneys for excretion, right? And the kidney is the primary organ of the excretory system, and it's going to be responsible for filtering blood, right? Humans have 2 kidneys. They're flat and bean-shaped, and they're about 150 grams, 11 centimeters or so, or roughly the size of a closed fist. So if you close your fist and you put it kind of right at the back of your, the bottom of your back, that's where your kidneys are. And they do a phenomenal job at filtering or receiving and working their way through about 1 liter of blood a minute, right? Which is why they're actually directly linked to your heart at all times, right? In other words, whenever the heart pumps, a special a special vessel is going to take that straight down your body, and then there's a kind of branch that leads straight to the kidneys. It's going to filter it, and then it's going to send the clean blood back into your heart, where it gets pumped around the body again. So a subsection of that goes in, and then all of the urea, the waste, that's going to go out through the kidney and down towards your bladder. Here's what your kidney looks like if you were to fill them up with blood, and you can see there lots and lots of blood network. There's your main aorta, and then there's the branch that leads away from it, and then obviously there's another 2 that leads back to your heart as well. And then this is what a kidney looks like when you cut it in half. There's your blood vessels coming through, and then also there's your collection and the rest of your kidney there as well. Okay. Main functions of the kidney: it's going to remove waste and excess hormones from the blood. It's going to reabsorb any water that kind of got lost in the process, and regulate its ion balance. And then it's also going to maintain blood pH level so that the blood is at the adequate pH level for its function of the cells inside of the blood. Okay. Components of the kidney, right? So if you look at the kidney, it's different components are responsible for different aspects of that blood filtering process, and there is a lot. Okay, so let me briefly go through with them and give you a kind of a general idea of what they look like. Okay. You got your artery and your vein that's going to deliver the blood into and from the kidney, and that's the renal artery takes blood into the kidney, and then the renal vein takes blood out of the kidney, and blood coming into the kidney is going to be fairly full of waste products and urea, and then blood coming away from the kidney is going to be quite clean and free of waste products. Okay, you've then got a capillary network, a spread of blood vessels around the top of the kidney and around the outside layers of the kidney, which are then responsible for that fine-tuned movement of the blood out of the arteries and the veins. Okay, and within the kidney, you also have the renal medulla. The medulla is the inner region of the kidney. So the medulla is represented by this little kind of branch here, and all of that is the medulla region. So all of this is the bulk of the kidney. Right, it's the inner region, and it's going to be made up of several components called the renal pyramids, and each pyramid is kind of like a processing center in the kidney. Right, as the blood goes in, it's going to then go through the pyramids and then work its way back out as it's being filtered. Okay. Surrounding the entire kidney is called the renal cortex. The cortex is like kind of like the outer region, and it houses all of the capillaries. So there's your cortex layer right there, and you've also got a little membrane that kind of fills the outside of your kidneys as well. And then down the bottom where the collection occurs is the renal pelvis, and that's where all of that collection from the renal pyramid is, and all of the waste products drain out of the renal pyramids and into the renal pelvis, which then sends it to the ureter, which then sends it to the bladder, where it's stored until you basically decide to pee it out. Okay. All right. If you break the kidney up into smaller components, you get millions of nephrons, right? Roughly about 1 million in each of your kidneys. And the nephron is the individual unit, right? If you think about it, in the same way that a cell is a single unit of the body, a nephron is a single unit of the kidney, okay? And so nephrons have the really important role of doing that actual filtration. So the pyramid is full of nephrons, and each nephron does 3 things. It's going to filter the blood and remove the filtrate from the blood. It's going to reabsorb any sort of water, salt, and ions and other important substance that kind of got lost along the way. And then it's also going to actively secrete and get rid of things like drugs and ions from the blood into the tubules. So your kidneys are doing a really important job of kind of removing any sort of drugs that you take. And you don't take drugs because you guys are great students, right? So here's the different components of the nephron. So there's the kidney, there is the pyramid, and then there's the top of the pyramid with the nephron. And the nephron kind of runs its way up, linking to other nephrons as well. And then this little section here, this little thing, that's a nephron right there, okay? And it contains a few different parts, okay? So I'm going to explain how this particular process and go through how each function of the nephron works, and this process of filtration, how that works, okay? It's broken down into about 6 or so steps, so you're going to have to follow me pretty closely. So when blood comes in through the kidney and goes into the renal artery, it's going to spread out through that capillary network, and each capillary network is linked to a glomerulus. A glomerulus is a clump of blood vessels that sits inside a second one called the Bowman's capsule, and the glomerulus, right, blood's going to go into that, and because of the way that it is structured, it's going to kind of break up into this little cluster of blood vessels, and then that high pressure is going to force all of the liquid in the plasma out of the blood and into the Bowman's capsule, okay? 20% of the blood plasma is going to leave the blood and go into the Bowman's capsule, and then all of that kind of, all of the waste products like the urea and so forth, that's going to get pushed out of the blood and into the nephron and tubing itself. Now, proteins and blood cells are too big, so they're not going to fit through the blood vessels. And so you don't have to worry about losing blood cells through your blood, but all of the liquid stuff, that's basically all going to get pushed out. The Bowman capsule then collects that filtrate. The filtrate is what we call the material that's being filtered, and it's going to send it through the proximal tubule. It's called proximal because proximal means close. If something is in your proximity, it's close to you. So the proximal tubule is close to the Bowman's capsule. and then the proximal tubule is going to reabsorb some of those lost solutes that is going to be useful for your body later on. So that filtration happens here, and then it's going to reabsorption happens here. Okay, the molecules that the proximal tubule reabsorbs include things like glucose, amino acids, sodium, potassium, and a bit of water gets pushed around here. Okay. From there, it's going to go down the loop of Henle. The loop of Henle is named after a guy named Henle, and basically it contains two parts. Okay. The ascending arm and the descending arm. Okay, the ascending arm, this one here on the right, that is going to extract salt ions and actively transport the salt out of the tube and into the surrounding cells. Okay, the surrounding cells is called the interstitial fluid, and that's going to super concentrate the salt, right? And so as it goes out, it's going to send more and more salt into the cells here, and it's going to super concentrate this particular fluid section. And what's going to happen is, because there's so much salt in here, all of the filtrate on the descending arm, that's going to start actually losing water via osmosis, because water is going to leave the tubule and re-enter into the salty region over here. And so water is going to passively move into the interstitial fluid via osmosis because of the salt concentration right here. So what you're seeing is you're going to see water leave through here, and then as it goes around the other side, your kidneys are going to pump salt and ions out of this particular section. And what that's going to do is going to kind of be a positive feedback loop. The more you pump salt into this region, the more water is going to leave. And so your body is really good at regulating, because basically the more thirsty you get, or the more water you need to reabsorb, it's going to pump more salt here, it's going to reabsorb more water, and then your pee, which is what's going to come out eventually through this urine, that's going to get more and more concentrated and turn more yellow as your body requires more of it. Okay, so that's how the loop of Henle plays a really important role. Okay. After that, it's going to move into the distal tubule. Now, the distal tubule is related to the capillaries that are coming out of it. And what it's going to do is it's going to reabsorb drugs and other substances that you don't want in your blood out into the distal tubule. And that's going to pump and throw that into the collecting duct, which then sends it down into the renal pelvis, which then goes out into the ureter and send it down towards the bladder. Okay. So that's kind of where the pathway of all the filtrate goes. The blood, now that it's clean, that's just going to work its way through the capillary, and it's going to exit the vein and go back to the heart, where the clean blood then gets go back to the heart, where it's get pumped around the body around the second time. Okay, so your body is constantly filtering and constantly pumping blood around. Okay, now the last part is how does your kidney also then regulate this particular process? Okay, so the regulation of the kidney is done via a hormone called the antidiuretic hormone, or ADH. So it's the hormone that's going to regulate that reabsorption of water and those ions in the kidney. Okay, the process of regulation happens like this. Okay, the hypothalamus is going to keep track of how much water is in the blood. So the more that the blood concentrates, the less water there is. So let's say, for example, you've been running around the whole day, you've been sweating and all the water leaves your body, you get really thirsty, you haven't drank a lot of water. That's going to trigger the hypothalamus to detect that, hold on, your blood's getting pretty concentrated because there's not a lot of water in there, and then the blood volume changes. Then it's going to act and react with the pituitary, and it's going to release ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. The ADH is going to do a few things. Number one, it's going to travel to the kidney, and then what it's going to do is going to open the aquaporin channels, allowing more reabsorption of the water in the nephrons, as we discussed earlier in the loop of Henle. And then number two, the muscles around the blood vessels, they're going to vasoconstrict, which means it's going to increase the blood pressure. By increasing the blood pressure, it's going to speed up the filtration process in the kidney, particularly through the glomerulus, right? So when you speed up the process, it's going to push more filtrate out. More filtrate means that you're going to be able to reabsorb more water in your blood. And then the ADH also influences the anterior pituitary, which then is going to release the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which then makes you stressed. So actually, when you don't drink enough water, you get stressed. So you really should drink more water because your body's basically telling you to drink more water, right? That's basically how the pathway, that signal pathway for ADH regulates your water. So that's how your body kind of regulates thirst. It's going to regulate your water reabsorption, and it's going to allow you to regulate how much water your body is picking up at a time, okay? Certain things are going to influence this process. So for example, consumption of alcohol and coffee is going to suppress the release of ADH, and therefore these particular materials, they're going to act as what we call a diuretic, right? And so what it does is anti-diuretic is going to increase the reabsorption. Well, coffee and alcohol suppress that process, and so that's going to make you pee more, and then you get really dehydrated when you drink a lot of alcohol. And a lot of the hangover stuff that you get from alcohol, that's because your body is basically running out of water, and then it's suppressing this water reabsorption process. So you kind of drink heaps of water and you pee it all out, not realizing that your body needs to reabsorb some of that water. So one of the things that you have to do when you get drunk is to drink lots and lots of water. But you guys don't get drunk because you're great students, okay? All right, so that's it from 4.3. Hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll catch you guys in chapter 5.